Hello watch enthusiasts! Now, the vintage market for watches, as is often shown by auctions, as well as the general sales prices one sees for certain models, it is a fickle industry and a fickle market, in the sense that the models which are often appreciated are certainly important historically and often very beautiful, but don't necessarily show the whole extent of interesting pieces available on the vintage market. And so in this video, following on in fact from the various watches which have been released recently for sale at auction in the last few days, I'd like to speak about 4 watches which I feel played a very crucial, very important factor and very important role in the histories of their respective brands, or indeed simply the history of watchmaking, but which haven't received that sort of sudden popularity which has seen models like, for instance, the Rolex Daytona gain so much traction on the vintage market. And so these are watches which, firstly, can be acquired for reasonable prices by comparison to their contemporaries in their respective categories, but also watches which will appeal to the collector in a way which I feel sometimes the headline lots at auctions are just a little bit too much for. I would also like to make the announcement today that over the next few weeks, as a result of restructuring the channel, potentially renaming certain aspects, and developing essentially a full-time occupation from my YouTube productions, which I hope will become my main career, I will only be producing 1 video a week, or thereabouts, over the next few weeks as a result of this, and also due to certain aspects in my personal life which make running the channel rather a lot more difficult. Now, those who know me will know these particular reasons, but rest assured that my channel will be back to normal by the summer when I will be producing videos and hopefully other content which hopefully you'll be able to see very soon. And so I would greatly appreciate it if you could bear with me during this period, as hopefully what is to come will be far, far greater. But if you enjoy what you see here on the channel and find the content interesting or useful, then do remember to subscribe to see more, and also do follow me on Instagram to be able to access more content which otherwise wouldn't be available here on the channel, especially live content of events taking place, and that address is now on the screen. The first piece I'd like to speak about is a model which you've now seen for a few minutes during the intro to this video. And this is a watch which is from Tudor, and in recent years Tudor have become very collectible, whether it's the Submariners with their Marine Nationale connection, which have gained a great deal of value, but also one has seen standard, more common models, such as the Oyster Prince, becoming very popular as an attractive and more affordable and arguably more serviceable alternative to a Rolex. However, I feel that with this, which is the Tudor Adviser, one sees a watch which has the same appeal as some of the very desirable calendar watches with oyster cases from Rolex, which we've now seen selling for very high prices at auction. Because this model was released in 1957 and ran all the way through to 1977, but one rarely sees them in fact, because they weren't particularly popular models in the day, and have a unique movement too. And what's unique about this watch is that it's the only watch made by the Rolex or Tudor group which had an alarm. And this piece was produced during its 20-year tenure in really 2 generations. Now, both generations were around 34mm, the second being 34.5, but if you're looking at older Tudors, then this is a very conventional size to look at anyway. Now, the first generation come either in the 7926, which had a normal oyster-style case, although not to the same specifications as a normal oyster case, and then the 1537, which had a narrower case, a more delicate build, and was more of a sort of dress watch, if you will, rather than the everyday watch which the 7926 was. And these were an interesting alternative to other alarm watches on the market during the period, as they did still have the same 2-crown arrangement which has become very standard with watches such as those produced by Jaeger-LeCoultre with their very famous Memovox range. And with these watches you had 2 crowns operating several different functions, with the top crown winding the separate spring barrel which operated the alarm function as well as setting the alarm, whilst the lower crown was the operation of the rest of the movement and the winding. Because this watch was a manually wound watch which didn't use a Rolex or Tudor movement. Instead it used an Adolf Schild movement called the AS 1475, a manually wound 17-jewel piece which was rebranded and decorated by Tudor, but still remained a third-party movement. And these pieces have become very interesting models on the used market, being available now for well under £1,500, but having an array of beautiful dials, often with sunburst silver tones and Dauphine hands, and especially the versions which are this early generation, because they have the older style of Tudor logo with the rose instead of having the shield seen on later versions. These versions at the start also had the rather curious aspect of not having a 2-piece case back. Instead, they had a drilled hole with a sort of a peg in it, if you will, which was struck with a hammer to be able to give the resonant sound which you would expect from an alarm watch. Then on the second generation, produced from 1969 to 1977, one saw the 150, which was a reference which was really a replacement with a modern Tudor shield and baton-style hands, which takes on a much more modern form. And I think if you're not interested in the standard Rolex look, then this is perhaps an interesting way to go. These also replace the original Adolphe shield movement with the caliber 3745, which retained much the same design, but updated the concept, and also did have a two-piece caseback. And I feel the reason why these pieces are somewhat underappreciated is that they don't fall into the normal categories of the Tudor Rolex group. However, I feel that considering the fact that the calendar movements from this brand, which have recently skyrocketed in price, are having this sort of revival of appreciation, it's not too far of a leap to think that these watches might also receive a little bit more attention from the collector and a bit more interest considering their unique nature. Now, this second piece which I'd like to speak about is a model which was born in the 1950s, a time when mechanisation was becoming more of a problem for watches. Because surrounding watches, the world of electrical appliances, as well as just electrical needs, was starting to affect their timekeeping. Because watches, especially of the period, were very susceptible to the effects of magnetic fields, changing the effective length of their springs by causing the different parts of their springs to be magnetised and thus stick together. And this had a major impact on accuracy. And so it was a period when a number of anti-magnetic watches were released, and of course the most famous and most collectible, now with prices which extend well above £10,000 and £20,000, one sees the 1956 release of the Rolex Milgauss and the 1957 release of the Omega Railmaster. However, the slightly less appreciated and slightly less recognised sibling of these was the Ingenieur from IWC. And this was released in 1954 in the form of this 36mm watch in stainless steel with a very traditional shape for a dress watch, with this circular build to the case, as well as having these lugs which jutted out in this brushed and polished finish to give this very elegant but also slightly more sporty appearance to this 36mm watch. Under their beautifully domed acrylic crystals, which really were typical for the period, these watches had dials which were far more delicate in many ways than their contemporaries in the form of that Rolex, or indeed that Omega, because these pieces did predate them and came with a far more dressy dial. Now, the dials did still have a certain luminous capability, with some luminous treatment to the hands, as well as pips around the dial, with 2 at 12 to be able to read it at night easily. But aside from that, they were very much dressy dials, with this cream silvered appearance to this sunburst dial, or some black dials also available. Now, the indices were also applied in these baton forms, and were very beautifully applied to the dial as well, it should be said, whilst the hands were these very elegant and very delicate styles of Dauphine hands. The date was seen on these pieces on the 666 AD, whilst the 666A simply had a no-date dial. But the aspect of these watches which has gained the sort of reputation, support, and the admiration, in fact, of auctioneers and vintage watch collectors has been the aspect of this watch which has taken place internally. Because these pieces, despite looking like these very delicate dress watches with these beautiful bracelets, had a very high water resistance. They also had, of course, a soft iron core, and this allowed a protection of the movement from magnetic fields by essentially deflecting it around the movement, like one could say a Faraday cage, for example, with the use of this internal case within the external water-resistant case. And this was made out of the dial as well as a plate within the caseback, which allowed the whole watch to have this protection from magnetic fields. But also the movement inside this watch was very impressive, because it was the caliber 853, although one also saw the 8531 seen on the date version. And these were movements which were beautifully finished, it must be said, in-house movements produced by IWC. And these movements were developed under the famous Albert Peloton, who also developed the Peloton winding system, which is the automatic winding system used in in-house IWCs, which is a very efficient technology, and really has this quiet innovation to it in terms of giving you more efficient winding and a different approach to automatic winding than you would normally expect within a watch which certainly doesn't boast about having this sort of innovation. But the reason why I feel these watches are going to gain popularity, or at least certainly deserve to gain popularity, is because one sees watches from Rolex, such as the 1019 Milgauss, gaining enormous value and selling for easily 5 times as much as these watches, at in some cases over £20,000. Meanwhile, one also sees original Railmaster selling for an extremely high price, well over £10,000 very often. However, by contrast, this watch remains around the £5,000 or £6,000 mark, which is by no means a small amount of money. However, when you consider the fact that this watch started a line which really did make IWC very famous, with the Ingenieur later on, after being redesigned by Gerald Genta, for example, with the integrated bracelet, but also as a watch which developed a very different strain to the pilot's watches one normally sees or expects from IWC. And whereas the Railmaster for Omega was never a really staying line, certainly it had its appearances and now of course is cemented in the range, but for a long time it didn't continue in the same way. And meanwhile the Rolex Milgauss is a watch which is not the most desirable of models in the Rolex line presently, and whilst this has no effect on their vintage prices, I think it says a lot about the fact that this watch deserves to be in this pack of specialised anti-magnetic watches far more than it currently is. The next watch in this video is perhaps an unlikely choice, but bear with me as I feel it's one of the most underappreciated models with regards to general interest. Because everyone recognises the Breitling Navitimer, certainly everyone in the wristwatch sort of community will recognise this design. But with so many of these vintage chronographs, the early generations are simply unattainable in terms of price and in terms of rarity. However, the Breitling 806, being the first of the Navitimers, is far from this. Now admittedly, the very early models, with their exquisite syringe hands and their all-black dials, are certainly extremely expensive to get hold of because of the rarity of these early 1954 models, for instance, the early versions which used the Veltro 72 manually wound chronograph. However, if you look to the later versions, you can find a truly remarkable piece with a fascinating history which doesn't have the same appreciation as, say, an Omega Speedmaster from the same period, but which I feel has all the pedigree you might want from a watch which has had a fascinating story. And really the birth of these pieces took place, as I've said, in 1954 as a result of a need for a new pilot's chronograph to fit all of the needs which a pilot might have for using that slide rule bezel, which had been seen previously on the Chronomad from Breitling. However, following this 1954 release, which also featured the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association logo on the dial, although not seen on the European versions, this watch became something far more general and far more popular, as one saw versions with these earlier smaller silver subdials or later larger subdials running a Venus 178 manually wound chronograph movement running at 18,000 vibrations per hour. And these watches are utterly classic in their design, being produced through from 1954 all the way through until the very early 70s. And they've also seen a great deal of action, you could say, because these watches were used by people who you might not have expected other than simply pilots. Because it's believed that Scott Carpenter wore one of these pieces during the Aurora 7 spaceflight, which was the first US manned spaceflight in 1962. Now, unfortunately, the watch, it's believed, has been lost, and was lost as a result of being sent to Breitling to be repaired after being damaged by water upon splashdown, but was replaced by the Breitling Cosmonaut, which went on to be their attempt to make a space watch with its 24-hour dial. But this does give a certain story to a watch which otherwise I feel is often disregarded as being something which is simply not of the same pedigree as other period chronographs. And I think the reason why these watches should be more collectible than they currently are is rooted in the fact that they are such an iconic design. Because in many ways these have defined the appearance of Breitlings throughout the rest of their history. Now, of course, it's worth saying that for the vast majority of consumers, buying a Breitling dive watch, for example their Super Ocean, is a far more approachable concept than buying a Navitimer, because the appearance is something which is far more of an acquired taste. However, in terms of defining what the brand represents as a pilot's watch brand for most people first and foremost, this piece was truly iconic and highly influential. Of course, the prices for these watches are by no means low. However, it is worth considering the fact that for one of these pieces, it's rare to see a model which doesn't have a particularly remarkable history or isn't a particularly rare early model go above the £6,000 mark, and usually one sees them for far less than that, with some selling with decent movements for as low as £2,500. And this does raise a few questions in terms of the reasons why these watches simply aren't quite so appreciated, and perhaps it is down to the fact that Breitling haven't had quite such a smooth run in terms of ownership as some other brands, but still I don't think that's a reason why these pieces should be disregarded, as a truly pure demonstration of what Breitling could do in the period, and what Breitling represent and stand for even today, with a piece which is far more pure and far more aimed at someone who really does purely want a tool watch, as opposed to someone who wants something which is far more of a luxury piece. Now, the final piece I'd like to speak about is an oddity from the 1970s, and this is a version of the Omega Speedmaster which doesn't receive a great deal of press nor a great deal of appreciation. But I must say, having owned one of these pieces, it is one of the most interesting pieces with regards to being an understated example of quite spectacular 70s design and innovation, because this is the Omega Speedmaster Mark III. Now, naturally, owning one, it's unsurprising that I would mention it. However, I would take it as more of a view of the fact that I've put my money where my mouth is, because this is a piece which at the moment is available for around the £2,000 mark, but which I feel is such an influential piece to Omega's history and also the history of chronographs in general that it really deserved a place in this video. Now, the Speedmaster Mark III was conceived in the early 1970s when Omega was working towards producing its first automatic chronograph. Now, they'd already updated the Speedmaster line with the Mark II, which was meant to replace the Professional as a more updated and more modern format. Of course, this never really happened, but with the Mark III they were trying to introduce their first automatic chronograph, and so this watch was the first automatic chronograph from Omega. Now, it was a couple of years behind on the Zenith El Primero, for instance, which came out in 1969, as this piece came out in 1971. But starting with the rather remarkable movement inside this watch, one has to really look to the needs of that period, because naturally Omega was looking to follow on with the major leaders in the world of chronographs, such as Zenith, with their own automatic chronograph. And they looked to the Lemania company for the production of this movement, because Lemania had produced a great deal of their movements previously, especially their chronograph movements. Notably, if you look at the very famous caliber 321 by Omega, this was based on the 2510 caliber from Lemania through the 1940s, and so as a result demonstrates this partnership which continued to this point. And what they came out with was the Lemania 1340 and 1341. But in truth, the Omega version was very different to the standard version of this movement, as they increased the jewel count for Omega in the form of their 1040 caliber from 17 jewels to 22 jewels. They also gave it a golden finish to the movement, and also added that 24-hour indicator which rotates on a small disc underneath the small seconds, which really would have been ideal for astronauts had this watch been officially used by NASA, which it wasn't. But this movement now had the small seconds placed on the side of the dial, as well as the hours in their conventional place. However, they moved the minutes of the chronograph to the centre of the dial for added legibility, and also added the date to the side, which was a new feature for an Omega chronograph. And this allowed this watch to take on a very new format. And admittedly, the movement was rather thick at 8mm thick, but nonetheless was an impressive piece with 44 hours of power reserve and, of course, automatic winding. And this movement continued on for a few years, and this model was produced until 1975, but eventually this movement was simply too expensive to work on, because in terms of production, this movement had a lot of similarities with the older 321 caliber. Admittedly, a great deal had changed, but they did have to retrofit quite a lot of the parts to this movement to create a sort of a hodgepodge of older and newer parts in an extremely well-engineered and beautifully built format, but nonetheless an overly expensive one. But aside from this rather incredible movement, and historically very important movement, as really the end of the line for automatic developments of the older Omega movements in favour of the later Lemania 5100, which was an incredible movement in its own right, but didn't quite have the same pedigree as this particular piece. And this came in several versions, but have all shared this spectacular case, which was 41mm in diameter and almost 52 from lug to lug, which gave it this very large wrist presence, and something utterly alien for the period. And it came with several dial versions, whether one went for the professional dial in black and white, which is my personal favourite, or indeed one went for the sunburst blue or white versions with a silver tone to the surface of the dial. It was a very different piece. And it's believed this watch was also used by some Russian astronauts later on in the 1980s, as there are some photographs of them wearing suspiciously similar-looking pieces, which some have suggested are the Mark III. But certainly this piece was an utterly groundbreaking piece for its period, and marked something unique in Omega's history, as this case didn't catch on and was the most extreme of these Flightmaster-style cases. But aside from representing the absolute climax of these mad experimental cases from Omega in the early 70s, and also marking the end of a certain route for their movements, as whilst these automatic movements were used in the Mark IV Speedmaster, they really didn't continue far further beyond that point, and so as a result this watch was really the beginning and the end of that particular era of trying to make these movements work. But aside from that, these watches are also quite rare in good condition. Often they're very heavily water damaged and have been treated with very little care due to the fact that these watches were built in such a rugged format and did appear so much less of a dress watch than even a standard Speedmaster Professional. And so there is an element of rarity to them, aside from the fact that they are something utterly unique, and if you're able to get hold of one in good condition, they are truly beautiful in their mad 70s form, thus making them something of an acquired taste, but I think hopefully a future collector's piece as well. And so I'll conclude this video here, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of my choices, and also do tell me any of your own predictions as to what you reckon will be future collectible pieces, as certainly, according to all the information one can find, the really collectible pieces that are present at the moment are rapidly running out, and so there will in future be a real change of market as new pieces become the accepted and appreciated models on the market. And if you enjoyed this video, then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, out.